And today we're going to be digging into developer experience for API products. So in the past, we've covered some topics on API design, security, what it means to be an API platform. And today we're going to hone in strictly on developer experience. So there's a lot of new insights coming out recently about how you can productize an API and what are the best practices for doing so. A lot of that revolves around making developers happy, making a great user experience for developers, which has spawned this whole new class of thinking called developer experience. So we brought in some experts to tackle this issue. We have Emmelyn Wang, API strategist at Axway, and you can find her on Twitter as LifeWingmate right there. And we have Thomas Bush, a writer for Nordic APIs. We've had Emmelyn speak at Nordic APIs events in the past, but this is her first LiveCast. Very excited to have her join. And then, of course, Thomas has been writing for the blog for the past year and a half, I believe. And he's really been focusing on developer experience in a lot of articles. So I think his topic's going to coalesce a lot of that research. So really excited to see what he has to offer as well. Just a brief background for those of you unfamiliar with what we do at Nordic APIs. Essentially, we're an international community of API practitioners and enthusiasts. We hold 2 yearly summits now, one in Stockholm in October, and then another conference in Austin. And they're called API Summits, and we bring together hundreds of people to talk API strategy. It's a great resource for learning about our community, being introduced to new speakers, sponsoring and getting your name out there, etc. So we also run a lot of online stuff, such as the LiveCast, but we also run a blog with these high impact posts about API design going out every week. And a lot of those have been packaged into ebooks, which is all free. All the online stuff is free. No registration wall required, nothing like that. So a little bit about our upcoming event. We're very excited to organize the 2019 Platform Summit in Stockholm in late October. The theme is continuous API strategies for integrated platforms. And we're doing a 2.5-day summit, jam-packed with workshops, keynote sessions. We're going to have workshops on the first day, not officially part of the conference, and then the following 2 days. We have a lot of speakers lined up in 3 different stages. So that'll be great, big event. And then our third Austin API Summit, we're returning to Austin for the 3rd time, May 4th through the 6th. And our call for speakers opened recently, and we're starting to get submissions in for that. So 2 big events coming up. Hope to see you at one of them. We also have this yearly competition, our Best Public API competition, which is really fun. We get nominations throughout the year and then open source them to the community. We have a polling that's going to be opening in late September, and then we're going to announce the winner at the summit. Last year's was Ring Central. They took home the grand prize, and we have some great nominations this year. We're excited to see what happens. So back to today, our developer experience focus. Next up, we're going to have API as a product love with Emmelyn. And after each session, we'll do a little Q&A. So if you have a question, leave your question in the chat and we'll try to respond during that Q&A. After Emmelyn's presentation, we'll feature Thomas Bush and then do a little wrap up. So that's it for my introduction. Hope I didn't take up too much of your time, but I'll just hand things over to Emmelyn now.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yeah, of course. Great to have you here.
All right, let me know when you can see the deck.
Looks good for me.
Fantastic. I'm so grateful to Nordic APIs for having me today. and I wanted to talk about API as a product love as part of the developer experience for API products series. So a little bit about me, I led technical product marketing for an enterprise, and there were 40 different people on the team spread across 2 different continents. Have a master's in technical communication, and also I've been the developer community engagement manager for a startup called UShip back in Austin. And so my experience will be based on these perspectives, both in product marketing, in developer engagement, as a technical communication professional, and also developing products in general. And so today is all about how to sell developer experience to your organization if it's not one that understands the value of it. So Thomas will dive deeply into that in his section of this livecast, but there's such a huge overlap. And so what I'll try to do is just talk about the product piece. So APIs, if they're just projects, that means that you'll have limited and short-term resources. So if you treat them as products, then that's where you'll get the most resource allocation. And I have examples of how to sell that within your organization. Because oftentimes it's not about building the API or even treating it as a product. It's getting the stakeholders and the buy-in to make that happen. And when you make your API a product, sometimes it's a process of working with different groups across the company. And if your culture isn't built in a way where you can do that, I'll provide you with some tips and tools on how to make that happen. So typically the users of APIs are hands-on learners and want to try the API. So I'll show you ways that you can do that. Also, what does it take to deliver a stellar onboarding experience? So I'll give some examples that I've experienced, and when this YouTube video is live and on, is posted, feel free to comment about what you think a stellar onboarding experience looks like. And then finally, once you get that clear picture, now you can work with your business to get the resources to make that happen. So a lot of the times leadership and executives want to know, well, developers, will they actually pay for the use of this API? And the answer is long-term, if you develop a relationship with them and you treat the API as a product and you have that digital business success, that's where you're going to see the revenue gains. And so the reason I keep mentioning the business is because not all companies are born of that developer love, right? And so really helping them understand that when you treat the API as a product, that helps them internally and externally, because there's going to be developers inside the company and outside the company who will be using the API. So typically API product managers or product managers in general understand who has skin in the game. So there's this agile cartoon that's famous, and if you don't know about it, it's basically a pig and a chicken say, hey, let's open a breakfast joint. And the chicken says, oh, it's going to be called eggs and ham breakfast joint. And the funny part about that is, you know, the chicken doesn't really have as much skin in the game. And so from an agile standpoint, as a product manager, really understanding who the stakeholders are and who has skin in the game and who benefits from producing the API as a product will help you give the API more product love. So let's start off with some of these assumptions. So today, the API and digital products are representations of what we experience in the physical world. The US Postal Service has something called informed delivery, meaning before you ever receive your physical mail or package, you can actually get a visual representation of what that piece of mail or what that package is about. This is kind of awesome because, as many of us know, the US Postal Service has been kind of lagging behind. So you have other mail and logistics providers that are really ahead, right? Obviously, Amazon, FedEx, USPS, DHL, and just native services are really honing in on the experience. And so USPS came up with informed delivery to try to help you see your mail in a digital light. So the next assumption is a company or organization needs to understand that developer experience plus API as a product, both of those things together help you make your business operations smooth, and that in turn brings revenue. And so how do we explain? So basically leadership wants to know, what do I get from this API, right? Because an API can be a technical thing to a mixed audience. And also with the API and everything surrounding the API, how do we meet or exceed users' expectations? And then finally, how does this API and that experience fit into the real world environment? Meaning, okay, I can make this API call, but how does that look like for mission critical elements? For example, one of my colleagues is an instructional designer for Baylor Scott and White. And on the weekend, even though she's an instructional designer, she had to answer a ticket because a nurse couldn't reach the information they needed in the digital portal to serve a patient, right? And so these experiences can be very critical. Another piece is, who does the API touch? So if you really think about this, it's really everyone. So even though the developer is consuming it, you as the app user or the website user, you're being affected by the API. And then API support is also experiencing that. If something is down, then it comes back to the API provider or app provider to fix that. And so having graceful handoffs in that experience is going to make the API a good product. Also, you want to design for overlapping and concentric life cycles. So what I mean is the API life cycle may be very different from the product life cycle. So for example, a car has a much longer product life cycle, and the API life cycle might get updated many times. And so designing for these concentric life cycles, we could do a webinar just on this slide alone and breaking it down. But basically the maturity of the API and the maturity of the product, that's going to affect how you deliver. And then talking about some of the known patterns of these life cycles and ways of discovering these new patterns. Again, Bill, this might be its own LiveCast. So what happens is most companies, they think inside out. So I'll explain. So sometimes a developer says, okay, here's the ticket, just expose the API. And so say it's .NET code. They go in and they just expose the API in the code. But they're just working on this tiny piece and not really understanding both upstream and downstream who it's affecting. And so the reason why that's an issue is then other developers in the organization can't really understand how to use the API. And so what you want to do is you want to flip that. You want to think about everyone as your customer and how to serve them using the API. And so for me, I really cut my teeth on API support and as an API tech writer, and trying the API itself and how the consuming party would use it, and really having extreme empathy for them. And so if product managers can give testers and anyone working on the API the experience of how to serve a customer, that's gonna really help them develop the empathy. And then that empathy feeds back into this feedback loop. And when I say extreme empathy, I'm talking about Nürburgring level feedback. So if people don't know, the Nürburgring is this amazing racetrack in Europe where people, companies like Mercedes, Tesla, etc., Formula One racers can test how fast their cars can go. And they get feedback about speed and performance. And to me, that's what we need to deliver for the API as a product, is quick feedback, to the point where, as many of you know, unfortunately, this is a very dangerous racetrack. And so there's feedback on how to test your car on this track in a way that's safe, right? And the other phenomenon is a feedback loop is traditional personas don't really work anymore. And you can see my speaker notes below. So account executives that are selling to developers, that developer becomes the founder or the CTO or the investor of a company. Meaning the people today who are coding are also today's leaders and founders. And so the reason why that's important is now you can speak about APIs at all different levels. And the reason why that's important is the story of the Tower of Babel. So it means that when you're presenting the API as a product, you need to be able to speak to all levels of that spectrum of people that get value from the API. And so how do you get frictionless onboarding? So at first it's going to be kind of rough, right? You'll have APIs exposed either in a developer portal, a business portal, or a catalog. And you have to be able to find it, and you have to be able to onboard. And so I'm using this example from healthcare. Continuity of care is really important. It means that you use both automated and human ways of caring for people inside and outside of the organization who are trying to onboard to use your API. Also, in those spaces and in your documentation, you need to show a clear frame of reference, limits of the API, what you can and can't do with it, and I'll show you examples. A clear frame of reference as to where you are in the process. So I'll give you an example. I had signed up for MongoDB, and I love the fact that they have 3 little dots that show you exactly where you are. And Bill, you even did that with the Nordic API Awards. You showed kind of the process of how people sign up and where they can go, which I thought was really interesting. The other piece is don't overwhelm people. Your documentation should use the pattern of progressive information disclosure. And finally, you want dynamic information mapping. So basically a table of contents that's interactive, and I have an example of these coming up. And you also want to be very thoughtful. So Nordic APIs is a very good example of thoughtful design visually and using multimedia for people to find information. You also want your goal for end-to-end onboarding to be fast, tangible value, meaning you sign up, if you're vetted properly, both in an automated and human fashion, you can get your API key, you can try your API and have something in production. The goal is within 20 minutes, right? People are able to find not only what they need, but also when they need. And so anyone that runs an API program should use a search engine and do a content audit in a scheduled fashion to check. So for example, is this blog article showing the latest information? When you search internally and externally information, you should be deprecating old information and making sure the newest information is either showing up top or trending, tagged properly. Use both automation and people to check that experience. I also mentioned test driving. So people who are using the API, they want to try it, right? And so offer playgrounds, sandboxes, sample code. If you have a Slack channel or some community forum, make sure you've got clear guidelines. Ping me if you want to see examples of community guidelines. Maybe it's containerized. So you just go to your command line and you can NPM or you can use your CLI to invoke what you need to test drive something, and then use videos. So accurate product and technical documentation, you don't want to say, well, this is what we think it does. You'll always want to make sure that that experience is current and work to anticipate needs of your users. And make sure that it's not just the initial experience, but they're also covering ongoing experience. So I'm part of Async API, which is, I think Bill is as well. It's an open source technical specification that's a sister spec to OAS, and they offer a playground. So typically people are not as familiar with messaging APIs, and so you can actually use this playground to import a document and to export a spec. And this playground is very friendly because, as you can see, you can use it either Markdown or HTML, and there's other ways of using this playground in an easy to consume fashion. And just like a real playground or a sandbox has rules, so you also want to set expectations in your playground and sandbox. So developer.dnb.com, so DNB Direct, they do this in their sandbox. I love the fact that they say, hey, this sandbox is a non-production service. You have to register. Here's what's going to happen after you register. Your sandbox access won't expire. Technically, here are the number of calls that you can make per week. Understand that this will go down. It's not a production environment. However, if you want to have a production environment, we have a path for that. So to me, these rules are awesome and helps me as a developer understand what to expect. And so I hope all of these tips showed you what it looks like to deliver a stellar onboarding experience. Our time is limited, so I wanted to now show you some examples of how you can work with the business. So I always love referencing the Cloud Native Computing Foundation because they show you step by step, 1 through 10, the path that you should be taking. So what you can do to show the business is how you can show your API and the path to what you're going to build. And then on the left side, it shows, okay, what help can I get for my API? And then on the bottom left, it clearly shows, for example, what is the value, and pretend it's this API as a product. And then you can also click into, so that map then basically helps you navigate this massive landscape. And on the left side, you can actually set filters by grouping, by category, by relation, by license. And basically you can, this is again, progressive information disclosure, the ability to just hone in on what you really want to see. Another example is information is beautiful. So being able to visualize interactive information, so the graphic that you see, you can use filters just like the ones I showed in the previous slide to really hone in on what you're looking for. And so on the very top of this cloud native interactive landscape, you can see how in the blue it says overwhelmed. Okay, here's how to navigate. But they show you that drone kind of Nürburgring view like I was showing earlier of here's the big picture, but you can zoom in and out. And then each one of these boxes, you can click on it and get deeper. So finally, I shared a ton of information, and depending on where your business unit or organization or development organization is, it's one step at a time. So what I recommend is you iterate fiercely to get there, meaning you start with something small and tangible where you can get value in 15 to 20 minutes, but think of the iterations as an ultra marathon. And you have to use techniques. For example, my colleague at Axway, he does something called chi running. And so he can do marathons using chi because he's able to have the energy to last. And the reason why I mentioned that is that's how you should run your iterations as a product manager. Finally, staying vendor language and tool neutral, which is what a lot of startups and companies want to do. Just note that that does create many cycles of work upstream and downstream. And then as a product owner, or product manager, it's different name at different organizations, show the end result and what I get from this. And as a developer, you're going to want to help your product leadership to do this, because a lot of companies don't understand why should they invest in the developer experience. Finally, you use sandboxes, demos, playgrounds, and allow time for people to test drive your API. When you do that, then they'll be able to understand the value of your API and give it more product love. When I share the deck, it'll include all of the resources that I'm referencing. So it's my experience, but it's also the love of this international community. And so I just really appreciate everyone that inspires me every day to do my work as an API strategist, and can take any questions.
That's awesome. I love that list of resources, because a lot of this kind of work, you know, you rely on the shoulders of great people. So we can link to any of that once we publish to YouTube, etc.
Sounds great.
But yeah, thanks so much, Emmelyn. Great presentation, so much in there. I specifically love how you're referencing these other sort of user interface, data-driven like examples and sandboxes from areas that might be outside of what we typically cover, you know, with like Twilio or Stripe and these kind of example APIs very often. So yeah, it's cool to get that perspective. And I especially like hearing where APIs are used in places like healthcare, even where developer experience could be a matter of life and death. And you never really think of that, like what we're doing right here could have a big impact. Yeah, so excellent analysis. Thanks so much for sharing all that. I had a couple follow-up questions if you're down.
Sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned it's really necessary to accept developer feedback somehow. What do you think is the ideal way for going about that? How do we accept feedback from developers who are extremely busy, don't really care, just need to make this integration work?
Sure. So it depends, and I'll explain. So a startup, a small to medium, well, SMBs, small to medium-sized business and enterprise, they're going to handle that differently, because most organizations are very resource constrained. And so to me, I think that it takes using a little bit of automation to be a force multiplier, and I'll explain. So for example, when I was at UShip, that's a startup, right? And so I had to wear many hats. And so what we used to do is we had a portal and a community, and we asked people to basically keep that line of communication that way. However, if you get a little bit bigger and you have a team that's handling that question, that you may want to use a tool like Zendesk, because I talked about continuity of care, and what you want is not to drop the ball. You want to make sure that you're answering questions, but sometimes you don't know if those questions are out there. So using something like GitHub is also very useful, because then, so Postman does this. So when I used to be a super user for Postman, if I had an issue, they would use something like a Zendesk, but then they would take that issue and post it publicly on GitHub, and they would say, hey, you can see the progress of your issue using this method. Because to me, that really builds trust to know that someone's actually working on it. And so, and again, enterprise is going to have a lot more resources, and they may prioritize and triage differently. So, but I think it's both, it's not just tools, it's also the way that people handle it. Yeah.
Like you say, the people that are today coding are today's leaders and founders. I like that little tidbit. So having empathy for them is obviously important. It seems like a lot of enterprises are they're playing a balancing game of how much information we're putting out there versus how much information, you know, we're keeping a little close guarded, perhaps for security reasons. But I usually err on the side of you know, great documentation, thorough. Is there anything you could say to those, you know, CEOs that might be a little hesitant toward anything that's close to open source? If that makes sense.
Yes. So basically there's the middle ground. So open source is ideal because you get the most visibility.
Yeah.
However, when I worked as the technical product marketing leader, what we did was we had a middle ground. So we basically had community moderation. So for the companies, I'll give you an example. It's basically a triangle view. So meaning the same developers who are working for Lockheed Martin, Apple, and all these very secretive companies at the top of the apex, they are also the ones that are needing information, but they can't ask those questions publicly, right, for IP reasons. And so what they can do is, so back in the day, we used Disqus, D-I-S-Q-U-S. I'm not sure if that's around anymore, but it allowed moderators the ability to field the question first, get the answer, and make sure the public answer is, not revealing anything too sensitive. And so to me, that's a layer of abstraction that helps any companies that are afraid of being fully open source.
Awesome. All right. I'm looking at the time here. I could talk about this for days, honestly. And I have some follow-up on incentive programs and reward programs, but I think I want Thomas to speak next, and maybe we can circle back and have more of a group discussion after that. Does that sound good?
That sounds awesome. I look forward to hearing your presentation, Thomas.
Sure, works for me.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, let's move on. So this is Thomas Bush, writer for Nordic APIs. Yeah, take it away whenever you're ready.
Sure thing.
And I'll just mute my voice here.
So Emmelyn gave some quite I feel like practical insights in her session just a second ago, and I want to give a broader, higher level view of some of my thoughts on developer experience, given what I've seen after looking into quite a few different developer programs. And so let's start off, hence the name for my talk, the holistic approach to DX. So I want to start off, let me just introduce myself. I'm Thomas. I'm a freelance business and technology writer, and I blog at Nordic APIs. I'm an amateur programmer, I'd say. My most recent project was a Telegram bot, which I wrote in PHP with the Telegram API. I'm still proud of that, and that was a couple of weeks ago. And I'm passionate about developer experience for a very simple reason, which is that about 10 years ago, I first started getting into programming. And I realized quite quickly that to make meaningful applications, it was really important to have a way to communicate with other applications, to communicate with the outside world. And so after quite a bit of time spent programming calculators and little encryption algorithms in Visual Basic and Python, I decided I wanted to build things that could read and write data from other sources on the internet. And this was 10 years ago. My programming skills were very, very basic. And I found it incredibly difficult to be able to read that data from anywhere on the internet, even just for simple applications. Like I once tried to program an iOS app that would gather Yahoo's weather data and display that with my own little icons. And so I kind of moved away from programming after that. And I think that was, to an extent, an issue of developer experience. And I feel like it's really important in an age where integration plays such a huge role in the functionality of our applications that we really pay close attention to usability of the APIs we're creating, so that we can promote as much development as possible. And yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you have questions about developer experience or want to chat. So let's talk about what to expect from this talk. I called it the holistic approach to DX because, like I say, I want to give an overall view and try and connect some of the dots. I think people can get in the weeds quite often when trying to tackle DX, and I think it's good to take a step back and look at what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it. So that's how I've structured this session. So as a short table of contents, I will be talking about what is developer experience, why it matters, and how to create a positive developer experience. First things first, what is developer experience? Very simply, developer experience is akin to user experience, but for developers. So it's the experience that developers have when using your API or when programming for your product. And it's the journey they face. It's all of the different things that they're exposed to and what they have to deal with. In general, it's the experience. It's hard to get deep into that. So I think instead of asking what is developer experience, a more interesting question is to ask, what is a good developer experience? And we'll discuss this a bit more later. But I want to introduce a definition here, which we'll come back to a bit later as we talk about different things. And that is, well, before I do so, in response to that question, what is a good developer? I think a lot of, for me, is things like complete, easy to read documentation with a few bells and whistles like dark mode and click to copy code samples. You've got your basic materials like SDKs or client libraries and code samples, and nothing like a good witty developer-facing Twitter account. So that's kind of the easy, in-depth, kind of close-up answer of what is a good developer experience. But I think a great way to look at it is a good developer experience is anything that makes it easier to use your API. So I realize some people might disagree with this, but I think this is a definition that I've kind of come up with on my own over the last couple of months. And I think it applies a lot of the time. And if you're working on improving the developer experience for your API, I think it can be a really helpful definition to come back to. So if you're trying to improve developer experience, I feel like really you're trying to make it easier to use the API. And we'll get back to how you can do that in a second. But first, I wanted to also discuss why developer experience matters, because I feel like that's important context. And what I want to start with is the question of why are consumers using your API? And I was looking through the Smart Bear 2019 State of API report a couple of months ago. And the top 3 reasons for using APIs are 1, interoperation between internal systems, tools, and teams. 2, reducing development time. And 3, reducing development cost. And I think the really interesting items there are reducing development time and reducing development cost. And for all 3 of these reasons, more than 50% of the surveyed API consumers voted for each of those reasons. So cumulatively, more than 50% of API consumers are using APIs to build faster and or cheaper. That's their main reason for using your API. In some cases, it might be the only integration that's available. It might be the only way to get that certain functionality. But a lot of the time, they're using your API because it's faster or cheaper than using another provider, or then building that same functionality in-house. And I think this is where we can come back to my definition of developer experience. We said earlier that developer experience, a good developer experience, or improving the developer experience, is anything that makes it easier to use your API. And especially in the world of development, I feel like easier means faster. If it's easier for a developer to use your API, for them to find what they're looking for them to handle errors, that means they're going to be able to do their job faster. And I think in a lot of cases, easier means faster. The next sentence, faster means cheaper, is not true for a lot of things in life. Usually, if you want something done fast, it's going to cost you a lot. But in the world of software development, if it's not going to take much time for a developer to create something, that's ultimately going to result in a lower cost for the company. So this is where I think developer experience becomes really significant. We said developer experience, once again, makes it easier and to develop. And because it's easier to develop, that's going to make it faster to develop an integration, and that's going to make it cheaper to develop an integration. And so for me, this is the big significance of developer experience. Yes, you can look at it like user experience, and it's just good to satisfy your customers, in this case, your developers. But this is a really, really specific way of looking at it, which I think is going to be, Emmelyn talked quite a bit about convincing stakeholders. And I think this is a great way if you're trying to convince stakeholders on the importance of developer experience, which is that by improving developer experience, you're supporting your customers in a way that's meaningful to them. In other words, by making it easier to use your API, you're making it faster and cheaper, which according to that Smart Bear State of API report are some of the main reasons for, or the main reasons for more than 50% of surveyed API consumers. And I think that's huge. Your edge, the reason you've been chosen as a product or a service is because of the speed or cost benefits. And if you look at developer experience as helping you maintain that edge, it becomes a lot easier to justify spending a lot of time and effort to pursue those things. And if you're wondering about that edge case where consumers aren't necessarily using your API for development speed or to decrease development costs, they're just using it for integration, I think it's important then to try and play up the aspect of and look at it as customer satisfaction. Ultimately, it's hard to measure the benefits of customer satisfaction. They tend to trickle out through the long term and affect your revenue in the long term. And that was also something Emmelyn touched on, that, you know, there's long-term benefits to developer experience. So I chose these specific examples because it's really easy to see how developer experience can benefit your organization. But even if your main kind of selling point isn't speed or cost, it's your developer experience is still really important for customer satisfaction. So let's get to the meat and potatoes, perhaps the most interesting part, which is for a lot of people, which is how to create a positive developer experience. And this is when you search the internet for developer experience, or when you watch developer experience podcasts or read articles, a lot of what people talk about is this particular section, how you can build a better developer experience. And ultimately, that's what a lot of API providers are interested in doing. But I feel like it's really important to have that context of knowing, you know, how you define what developer experience is for you. And I think my definition's great, but you might have others, and why that actually matters. Once you have those two pieces, it becomes a lot easier to look at it holistically and to have a better approach of what you're actually trying to accomplish when you're improving the developer experience. So once again, let's come back to my definition. Developer experience is anything that makes it easier to use your API. So the question becomes, how do you make an API easy to use? And there are loads of different approaches, loads of different ways to answer this question. People structure the approach to improving API usability in a lot of different ways. For the purposes of this, this presentation, I'm going to take you through 4 different points, and they're kind of ranked in order of importance. So the first way you can make an API easy to use is by designing for your consumers, for your developers. That, in my opinion, is one of the most important things. It's not the be-all and end-all of usability and thus of developer experience, but it's incredibly important later on. And without having intuitive design, without building your API intuitively, later on, trying to improve the developer experience is a bit like just trying to put band-aids on an issue. Really, you needed to have a solid data design to start with. Following that, I feel like that the second biggest, most important thing you can do to make an API easier to use and thus to improve the developer experience is to reduce technical overhead. And we'll go through all of these points in a second in more depth. But what I mean by reducing technical overhead is pretty much just allowing developers to focus on the logic of their application instead of worrying about how they're actually using your API or how things are structured in your API or the responses they're getting. Just effectively trying to reduce your API down to its functionality and giving a very seamless experience, giving users the functionality they need and the data they need in a very seamless way. After that, I think documentation is important and various other fallbacks. I'll get to what I mean in a second. And finally, we'll talk about, just for a few extra bonus points for your developer experience, you can add some tweaks to your API developer portal. So let's go through these, these concepts one by one. I mentioned designing for your developers. So you really need to try and match the way your API is built to how it's going to be used, because if you fail to do that, later on, it's going to be, no matter how good your documentation is, or no matter how many tweaks you add to your developer portal, developers are going to struggle to use your API because things just don't work the way they need them to. So questions you can ask yourself when designing are, do you offer the endpoints developers need? Are those endpoints named appropriately? Is it going to be easy for a developer to look at, to find the functionality they're looking for? Do they take intuitive parameters, those endpoints, and give intuitive responses? It's pretty obvious what kind of response you can expect from a weather API when you use a get weather endpoint. You're expecting a weather forecast or a weather status formatted in some specific way, and a temperature formatted in some specific way. If you've got a more complex API, you really need to try and make it possible for developers to almost guess how you're going to be handling their queries. And finally, are there webhooks where needed? There are a load of different questions you can ask here, but ultimately you need to think about how developers are going to be using your APIs. And that's one of the very difficult things about this. If you've got an API which has multiple purposes, which supports multiple use cases, it can be hard to design for all of your developers at once. Anyway, assuming you're not going to rebuild your API from scratch, or you're not building a new API, let's talk about some things you can do to improve the developer experience and make your API easier to use starting straight away. So I think the big one is reducing technical overhead. And down at the bottom of my screen, you can see a link to a Nordic APIs blog post I wrote about a year ago, I think. And this was some of Adil Ali's thoughts on optimizing developer experience. He runs a company called API Matic, where they do a lot of developer experience related things. And I noticed when looking at his ideas on developer experience for that blog post, his focus was exactly on this, on reducing technical overhead for consumers of your API. So in particular, that means taking care of redundant or repetitive tasks. So a great example of this is authentication. And it's a task that pops up in every application or every integration, and yet it doesn't affect the end. It's kind of, it's an extra to the logic that the consumer or the developer is actually trying to build. It's not necessary for their, or it is necessary for their application, but it's not really what makes their application their application. And so it's almost a redundancy or a repetitive task. And so this is where the importance really of SDKs, client libraries, and code samples comes in. You can make it a lot easier for the developers to handle those tasks, and or make it faster for them to handle those tasks. And then the other big thing that Adil Ali suggests is speaking the language of your developers. And once again, this takes knowing your developers, but really you want to know what languages your developers are using, and you want to try and support those languages, both with SDKs, with client libraries, in your documentation, and so on and so forth. Because like I mentioned before, you want using your API to be a seamless experience. I would almost say that a really, really developer-friendly API is almost so good that the developer doesn't even notice they're using it. They can just, they immediately know what endpoints they're looking for. They have redundant tasks immediately taken care of for them. And it's just kind of an addition to their programming language. It's just like another function they're calling. And I think that's a really important way of looking at it in this section of reducing technical overhead, which is trying to make it a seamless experience using your API, and doing so by supporting developers' favorite languages and taking care of those redundant tasks. Next up, we can talk about documentation and various different fallbacks. I put this third, which gives you the impression it's not very important. And I do think it is important, but I think it's very, very secondary to reducing technical overhead and designing intuitively. You'll find that if you have really good SDKs, client libraries, and code samples, your documentation might not even be used because developers won't really have to review anything. Everything will work as they expect it to. But the documentation is almost kind of there to support that. So what you look for in good documentation is things like an authentication guide, a quick start guide, definitions for all of your endpoints, code snippets, example responses for your different endpoints. And once again, at the bottom of this slide, you can see a link. I wrote a Nordic APIs post about 5 examples of great API documentation. And these different items here on the left were things I saw in all 5 of those examples. And some of those things there in the documentation, like the authentication guide or the example responses, things like that can sometimes be covered by SDKs or client libraries or code samples. So that's why I consider documentation of secondary importance. It's almost there to support those users with edge cases, or those users who don't have your intended programming language, because ultimately you're hoping that those users using your intended programming languages are using the materials like SDKs and libraries that you're creating for them. And then I mentioned other fallbacks here. What I mean by that is walkthroughs. If, once again, using your API should be intuitive, but if it's not, then you need to have some kind of video walkthrough that shows someone making their first Hello World application in your API, or the equivalent of a Hello World with your API, or you need to have some kind of dedicated support channel. Something I don't have on the slide here, but something that Emmelyn mentioned was Slack channels or community forums. These all contribute to the developer experience, but I consider them secondary, because if your API had the best possible experience, you don't actually want developers to need to look at your documentation or to even look at your forums or to go searching for fixes and whatnot. So that's why I feel like they should come after reducing technical overhead and designing intuitively. Last but not least, let's talk about a few little tweaks, the cherry on top. And once again, I got a Nordic APIs post here. I found 8 tiny API docs tweaks, which I thought were great. I think Bill did too. And some examples of those were things like instant load to save developers that bit of frustration while they wait for the page after their API the API integration is presumably broken. A status widget that prevents developers looking for a fix when really it's just your API. Things like click to copy, which I joked about at the start, or a table of contents so developers can find their way around your documentation, or a what's next page so developers can follow some kind of walkthrough, from going from one page to another to get started with your API. And these come last. I feel like they're all good things. They all have very small benefits, but again, these particular examples here on the slide are documentation related. And like I mentioned earlier, you really want your API to be so good and so intuitive that the documentation doesn't even pop up. So in conclusion, for me, developer experience is about making your API easy to use. That's important because easy means fast, and fast means cheap in development. And those are some of your consumers' top priorities. And then doing developer experience right, you'll probably need to come back to this presentation a few times to really, there was a lot here, but this kind of core section of actually how to get your developer experience to the standards you want. I feel like that means going through one by one and designing intuitively or redesigning intuitively, reducing technical overhead with things like SDKs, documenting and supporting developers who do actually have issues, who end up having issues despite how good and how intuitive your API is, and then adding a few tweaks just so that your developers love you forever. And so that's it. Thanks for your time. And once again, feel free to speak DX with me on LinkedIn. And I guess I will hand it back over to Bill now.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. Really great insights there. Essentially, that's what it means to have a developer experience first API. I mean, once you start like considering the empathy of developers, you consider what their end use case means. And so I love all your little tidbits and just like single sentences, you know. Developer experience is whatever makes it easier for the developer to consume the API. Love how you boil down topics like easier means faster, faster means cheaper, like a copywriter for Apple right there. So reducing those redundant tasks associated with APIs, we covered quick start guides, you know, technical guides, endpoint definitions like you're talking about, a lot of which you've covered with Nordic APIs in the past. As a writer, do you notice any sort of like technical language trends or anything API product owners should think about when they're actually writing the language that developers will be reading?
Yeah, great question. I think a lot of times, like I mentioned before, if a developer lands on your documentation, they might just be in the onboarding process. But other than that, they're probably landing on your documentation because they're trying to get something done or they're having some kind of issue. And so I feel like it's really important that that your documentation is written with the beginner in mind and made very understandable for all audiences. And even if you have technical language you need to include, or you need to reference other endpoints, or you need to reference different processes. For example, if you need to reference authentication, if you're in a troubleshooting section of your documentation, and you can't avoid going around these topics, I think it's less about the language and more about having the material there. So even if you're not trying to break everything down in the simplest terms possible, or on the contrary, use the most technical terms possible, as long as you can link developers to some kind of other resource for that, which explains it, you know, within reason, then I think that's most important.
I've also seen providers provide some sort of glossary that helps identify all these complex acronyms that we just use on a daily basis without even thinking. But you're right. Everything needs to at least be accessible for that beginner developer. You know, we always start our tutorials and walkthroughs on the blog with, you know, download this dependency. You're going to need this requirement before starting anything. And hey, let's define what that is for someone who's never programmed anything first, you know, set the baseline. So yeah, great insight. I completely agree. API product managers need to think about that, definitely. You also recently wrote about developer-facing reward programs. I think you were covering that talk by Matthew Revell at a recent API summit. I was curious if you think that is part of your definition of developer experience, because it's not exactly making things easier, but it's perhaps building a community that is kind of an experience for people. You know, if reward programs work versus if they don't, that's a whole nother question. But I guess, yeah, do you consider that part of this conversation?
I've tried to stay very focused purely on developer experience itself. And in a word, I feel like champion programs like that aren't a part of developer experience. They can contribute to developer experience in the same way having, you know, active Slack channels or a community forum can, in that you can have community members working with one another to fix things and to create things. So I would say, actually, maybe I'm changing my mind a bit here, but I think that relates to the developer ecosystem around your product. And it relates more to the developer ecosystem, which kind of indirectly can benefit developer experience, but doesn't have to. So yeah, that's what I would say. It's more about the developer ecosystem, and you can tie that into your developer experience as one of those fallbacks I mentioned, like community forums or a Slack channel, but it doesn't need to be inherently DX related.
Yeah, Emmeline, maybe do you have anything to add on that if you're chiming in here about developer ecosystems and creating a community around either reward programs or any sort of channel?
Sure, I do. So I was personally there at Matthew's talk, and
Yeah,
also went to the Developer Relations Conference in London last November. And so to me, I want to first start by mentioning specific developer communities. So the Vue.js developers community, which Anthony Gore, he creates some amazing assets to get people interested, and he uses videos, newsletters, and is running that community. So, major shout out to him. Women Who Code is obviously an international organization that's making it very friendly for anyone to transition into being a developer and helping them understand what resources are available for both men and women that contributes to a better developer experience, like Thomas was saying. And to me, the reward for the developers is honestly their satisfaction being able to build something that works. Like Thomas was saying, I'm really proud of what I built just recently, and I got to use the knowledge very recently to create something. That's part of the reward. So Matthew teaches that developers are generally very cynical, and so we want to know what is actually real, when the rubber hits the road, what can I actually do? So that's part of the reward. But I think there's other major perks to being a developer. And so, for example, bounties are very big. So at UShip, if you found a bug, you might get rewarded with something and recognized at the morning stand-up, for example. Right. And there's just programs like that, but it's got to be a meaningful reward to that type of developer or developer community. Meaning, if it's not a meaningful reward, then that program, loses its value.
yeah. And sort of generalize, developers are angry or, they're upset or just cynical. I mean, they're real people at the end of the day. But I think anyone shares like an obvious pride when you accomplish something, right? And I think developer programs should highlight that and give credence to that, and have a little place where these use cases, these end products are showcased, for example. I see a lot of API programs doing that, especially. I kind of have one question for the both of you. How do you think the developer experience changes or needs to be catered differently to when we start to go through different types of developers? Like when the consumer changes from internal to more of a custom partner relationship, and then I think most of what we've been talking about has been more public-facing, self-service APIs. So when we're less of a forward-facing product, but more like an internal chargeback sort of model product, or something that's more custom partner driven, how do you see the developer experience changing? How do we market APIs differently?
So Thomas, would you like to start, and then maybe I can close up?
Sure thing. Great question, Bill. Again, I think this is, I don't want to sound like I'm using a catch-all here, but I think this is the benefit of aiming to, kind of draw your developer experience strategy or revolve your developer experience strategy around designing intuitively and reducing technical overhead, because those are things that are ultimately going to be positive or result in a positive developer experience for whatever consumer is using your API, no matter whether they're a partner, no matter whether it's an internal API, no matter whether it's a public API. If your API is intuitive, if that's a priority of yours, that's a universal thing. And so same with trying to reduce technical overhead. Client libraries can be a thing, no matter whether it's an internal library, an internal API, a public API, and so on and so forth. But then I think those lower two rungs I mentioned tweaks at the end, but more importantly, I talked about documentation and having different support channels and other fallbacks for when developers do actually need your assistance. And it's definitely a good question. I feel like internally, you can probably get the team that built the API in a lot of cases to directly provide support, which can be one of the most effective ways of doing it. Since if it's an internal API, you might be able to get away without needing to write a load of docs and just fix things on a case-by-case basis. The same goes for a partner-facing API, depending on the number of partners, which is that you might be able to get away with direct support for a lot of it. But I feel like the big thing is just looking at how your API scales, and as your API scales, asking yourself whether would it be cost effective for me or for our team at this point, instead of providing support whenever someone has an issue, to start channeling more time into building documentation and so on and so forth. So I think it depends a lot on the size of the API and the number of consumers.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I think Thomas, thanks, Bill. Thomas, I totally agree with your answer. And then on the ground, the reality is that a lot of companies, they're dealing with technical debt, and each of their legacy backends is going to be different, and they have to expose all of those as APIs. And so the reason I mentioned that is, so being an API tech writer, that's part of my career, I would argue that you want to involve documentation in the beginning because they can give feedback to design. So having documented many APIs, it's like a Tomb Raider. You actually find a lot of the dead bodies, and you can give that feedback to help make the API design better. Because a lot of companies, at least here in North America, we don't have the luxury of designing an API from scratch. We typically are using a SOAP API, but we have to then make it a REST API. And so, we have to deal with that part first. And then the other thing I was going to mention is there's a huge trend now where developers and documentation folks, there's a huge overlap, meaning a lot of software developers, the next step in their career is actually to become an API documentation engineer, or vice versa. People who create documentation, because they're so into the API, they then cross over and start coding and developing to better understand the developer.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of scenarios, and it really depends on what your exact company's comprised of. Awesome. Well, I think we have to wrap things up. It's been excellent having both of you. Thank you so much for participating in this live cast. I'm very honored to host. I'm going to wrap things up here, unless there's anything else we should cover. Emmelyn, I'm going to want to see that sort of API developer trail written in the future. And,
absolutely, I can work with you on it since you're so good with graphics.
Oh, maybe, yeah, that'd be fun. And then Thomas, that PHP wrap up on Telegram, we got to put that out too.
Yeah, definitely. Can include it in the description of this video when you publish it.
Yeah, I'm gonna requirement have a date to publish and everything there. All right, guys, thank you so much. I just have a few wrap-up slides here. This has been a live cast with Nordic APIs. Thank you to our sponsor, Curity. They provide an OAuth server to help with identity control, access management, great for API security. And they'll be sharing some of these topics at a workshop upcoming at the Platform Summit. And you can follow Nordic APIs for future events, future thought leadership around API design and strategy at Nordic APIs there. We also have a Slack group right there. And like I said, the Platform Summit is next month, late October. It's going to be a great chance to widen your skill set when it comes to this kind of knowledge. If you yourself are interested in sharing an hour with Bill and other API nerds contact us here at info@nordicapis.com, and we can make that happen. Also, we do welcome contributions to the blog. I do preface by saying we don't do sponsored content, we don't run ads, and no, I'm not going to include a link to your blog post in one of our blog posts because you email me that question. Get a lot of that kind of spam every day. But we have a lot of great community submissions coming in for the blog. Like we just published something today, a great REST API walkthrough using Mongo database and Express.js and some other frameworks. Stuff like that, you know, that people want to read, that is thought-provoking around strategy or some sort of walkthrough. Very open to working with people to get that kind of knowledge out there. So you can look at our blog submission guidelines down there, nordicapis.com/createwithus. And we also have the newsletter, which I run partially for a digest for the content we put out. And then you also get some updates about events and such. So yeah, that has been our livecast on developer experience for API products. I hope you took something away and can now flourish with your API programs. All right, gonna sign off here. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
End meeting.